Do you have one of these on your hot rod and it just won't run? Well, stay tuned, because I'm going to show you how to take it apart, rebuild it, and inspect it. Welcome back to American Nostalgia Garage, guys, and today we're taking apart a 4150 Holley carburetor. It is a 750 double pumper, and we're going to go through everything as far as taking it apart, what everything does, how to clean it, how to put it back together. So stay tuned. Alright, at a first glance, just so we know what we're looking at, usually on the choke horn, which is this piece here that stands up, there'll be some sort of stamping or sticker or whatever, and it'll tell you what it is. This is a 4777, so that basically tells you, you can Google that stuff, it'll tell you what the kind of carburetor you have here. If anybody happens to notice, I actually cut the choke out of here. So this is the choke horn, that's this part, and the choke plate would be in here, and that I cut out. You can tell because I got a little crazy with the cutoff wheel. But never mind that. There's spiders in this thing. It's been sitting on the tool box for a long time. Needs to be gone through and rebuilt because we have cars here that could use this. Plus, it's always good to have a good extra running carburetor on the shelf. This is our fuel regulator. This would be where the fuel comes in. Not really what we're talking about here, the external part of the fuel system, but comes into two inlets that come to the carburetor. This spacing is different depending on what carburetor you have. Most carbs that have the secondary metering block, they'll be a little bit longer. And also, XP versus regular Holley carbs is different. So you got to make sure you get the right fuel log for your carburetor. Let's start with getting that off. So this process requires 2 wrenches usually, because there's a fitting on the carburetor itself that actually comes out, and we don't want that to come out right now. We are going to take it out to inspect it, but we don't want to take that out right now, so we're just taking off the hose. So it does require 2 wrenches just to make sure that the fitting on the carburetor itself doesn't come loose. So just for reference, here's what it looks like when that piece comes loose. I don't know if you can tell because the carburetor's moving and I don't have 15 hands, but this piece is moving free from the carb, and that's a real easy place to get a leak if you don't realize that happened. Alright, with the fuel line off, we will go ahead and take these fittings off, and when you take them off, you got to make sure you get this gasket with it, because the gasket, if it gets stuck on the carburetor or falls off somewhere, you'll have a leak if you don't have that gasket in there. And here's a good example. The gasket stuck to the carb, so you want to make sure you get it off. Okay, so the reason I take these off, this carburetor doesn't have it, but some of these have a little screen that goes in here, which is almost like a little fuel filter before it gets to the carb. So you might want to take these off of your carb just to make sure that you have it. If you know you don't have it, then it doesn't matter. You don't have to necessarily take these off. All right, now's a good time to talk about what some of all the stuff that's on the outside is. Obviously, you guys know this is all the throttle linkage here, all this. You've got the throttle linkage here that operates the primaries. It goes to a secondary linkage here, which operates the secondaries, which is here in the back of the carburetor, towards the back of the car. And under here, something that people don't see most of the time or don't tune or do anything with, is the accelerator pump cam. And this is the accelerator pump system. This circuit is designed for your acceleration enrichment. So whenever you hit the gas real quick and you want to take off, that's what this does. It gives you a quick pump shot, they call it, to get you from basically the idle circuit up to like the power circuit. This is the in-between, the bridge. So what it does is this little diaphragm here that's in here, there's a rubber diaphragm, and there's a cup. So this is a 30cc diaphragm, and what it does is when you hit the gas, watch what happens. See how it actuates down here? All the linkage pushes this arm, and it levers, and it pushes the diaphragm, which squeezes fuel out of here, this fuel cup, and into the carburetor. So there's one, this is called a double pumper because it's got one here, and it's got one on the back. Sometimes the back will be bigger, sometimes it won't. In this case it isn't, but that would be an upgrade to put the bigger diaphragm back here with the bigger, you know, pump shot. So that's what's going on here. The accelerator pump cam that I mentioned, that physically changes the way and the timing of how this pump shot is applied. So this pump shot has, it can be a different size. We can have a different orifice back here, which I'll get to, or we can change the way that it's applied and the timing of it with this cam. So that's actually an important tuning thing that people don't do. Also, something that to mention here while we're doing it now is that the distance in between this arm and this spring is important. As you can see, it's adjustable. You can tighten it and lower. You can tighten it and change the adjustment. But we'll get to that at the end. Here you've got your primary fuel bowl. This is basically your toilet. This is a tank that holds all the fuel that the carburetor has ready for its availability to apply and send into the engine right now. So it's basically like an auxiliary fuel tank, but attached to your carburetor so that it's ready to go. There's also one on the secondaries for the secondary setup, and that's it. This used to go to our choke when we had it. We don't have it anymore, so it doesn't matter. And on this side, same thing, accelerator pump cam and the accelerator pump system. On the bottom, we have the base plate. The base plate is a piece that's separate from the main body that comes off, and basically it's got like your vacuum ports, so you got like your big one for your brake booster or whatever. You've got one here, which basically is like would be your distributor for your vacuum advance. That's there. This comes off. And there are times, there's not a lot of tuning to be done on here, except for that, you know, this stuff is attached. Except for that sometimes you do have issues with like the throttle plates, and you got to get into like transfer slots and getting this thing to, you know, work properly. I don't know if you can see in there, there's a thing called a transfer slot, which is basically a little tiny slot inside the base plate, which it just has to do with basically how the idle circuit's going to function and whatnot. On top, we have some stuff. We got our boosters, 1, 2, 3, 4, for our 4-barrel. This is where the fuel is discharged from into the carburetor. Except for one thing, which is here, which is for our accelerator pump system. The fuel is discharged out of this squirter, which is, there was one here and one here. There's these, see these little stalks, these little pieces that come off here? I don't know if you can see that out on camera. That is where the physical fuel is discharged from. These squirters have a different number value, and basically it's the amount of, it's a number scale of how much fuel can come out. The higher the number, the faster the fuel comes out, the shorter the length of the pump shot is, which is important when you're tuning that to know how it works. The lower the number for the squirter, the longer the pump shot will be, but the less fuel that will come out all at once. Also in here, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. These little bosses here with a hole in it. That's an air bleed. And these air bleeds allow air into the system in order to richen or lean out a different circuit. Basically depends on what the orifice size is, and also we'll get into the emulsion tube that's inside the carburetor and how much of it is exposed and whatnot. So let's get to taking this thing apart. Alright, first thing I want to mention when we take these apart is most of the time these will be in your car when you're taking them apart. They won't be like this. So that being said, you're going to have fuel in here. So what I like to do in order to get these things off the car without making a huge mess is I use a very special tool, which is the nearest can next to you. And here's your little receptacle. Also, now you can just discard this because it's irrelevant. But you got your tool. So now what you do is what you would do is you would take out one of the bolts that's on the bottom, whichever one's easier for you to get to. And you got to keep in mind the carburetor will probably be flat like this, and what you would do is catch all the fuel in this little spray can top, and you could dispose of it. But you know, that's important to know because you don't want to make a mess. Also, put rags down. I'm going to take out all 4 of our fuel bowl bolts. They're 5/16 head. I'm going to get this off of here. Try not to tear the gasket. Okay, now inside. This is our float level. So if you hear a float level and you've never seen or understood what it meant, this is it. And without forcing it, this only goes so high. And basically that's done by this float height adjustment, which is on top, which is missing pieces, which is why we're rebuilding this. This threaded needle and seat assembly gets threaded in, which would make the float height lower, or threaded out to make the float height higher. And basically, the float height is important because that decides how much fuel is actually available for this engine, and again, how much stuff in here is exposed to fuel versus air, and how much gets applied. Again, here is our accelerator pump diaphragm. We'll take that off next before we move on to the carb. Also, I want to mention it only takes a couple tools just to take these things apart. One is flathead and Phillips head screwdriver. Maybe some adjustables, a 5/16. There'll be a bigger one when you get inside for the power valve. We'll show you that. And then just a wrench or whatever so you can get the needle and seat out. All right. Now here's our needle and seat. Basically what it is this little plunger that goes up and down, you can see, that rides on top of a little finger on this float. And what happens is when the float rises up, it pushes this up. It pushes this up and closes off this port in here, which is where the fuel comes in and goes down. So what you do is, in order to, what you do is you try to move this, your adjustment is basically moving this away or towards the float in order to change where the float actually actuates the on and off of this valve. So we'll put that to the side. This is a rebuild item, so this will be something you're always going to take out and change for the most part. I'm going to pull out our float so I can show you. That's a couple of small flatheads in here. All right, so here is the piece right there that rides on the needle and seat, and it would be like this. This bolts into our fuel bowl with 2 screws. Pretty easy. Just wanted to take it out to show it to you. What I'll say is these are not as much of a serviceable item. Yes, you can change them, but it's not something you do with every rebuild. What you would do here is these, you would just shake them around just to check that there's any fuel in them. In this case, this carburetor's been off of the car for a very long time. There's not going to be any fuel in here, but it would have evaporated. But it is empty, and these plastic ones are pretty good. So we'll put this to the side. We'll put it back together later. All right, all that's left here on our fuel bowl is our accelerator pump diaphragm. All right, that's the actual top part. Here is the diaphragm. Now, if you intend to use these, this is something you probably don't necessarily want to take off because you can tear this and you don't want to deal with that. There's a small spring in there which basically pushes the diaphragm back down. And then there's this little rubber check valve in here. This one is from another carburetor. I am going to pull it out. It's got this little like nipple thing on there that stops it from pulling back out. So that's our fuel bowl. We're done with that. Don't want to rip these gaskets either. Most of the time this will be something you want to have extras of, so if it's not bad you'll keep it on the shelf, which is what I'm going to do here. We got to get this off. Alright, here is our primary metering block. There's our jets, the thing you always hear about, which are basically what sends fuel into the booster to run the car at wide open throttle, cruise, or really kind of most scenarios. They come out with a flathead. Alright, the side of our jets have numbers printed on them so you know what size they are, and that's for tuning. These are 77s. Alright, here's something I should have mentioned we were on the outside, but I didn't, is the idle mixture screws. And the idle mixture screws here basically get turned in or out with a flathead, and there's a screw in there, I'll pull it out, that has a point on the end, and that point threads directly into a boss that carries fuel. And what it does is that point right there will block off or allow more fuel in order to change the mixture. So if you tighten it all the way in, that's going to block off more fuel because it's going to push it, the point all the way into the boss. If you back it out, it's basically going to allow all the fuel in that boss to travel through and be rich. For now, I'm going to turn these all the way in until they stop. I'm not going to crank them because that's just not what you do. Just do them both. Alright, the only other thing that is serviceable, sort of, on the metering block is the power valve itself. So basically it's a vacuum-operated on-off switch for more fuel to run through our jets and through our boosters and into our engine to enrich it in wide-open throttle when you have low vacuum. These will have a vacuum inches of mercury reading, usually somewhere on the face or on the side. This is a 6.5. The way you usually pick these is half of whatever your car idles at vacuum-wise. You'll pick that size. If it's a whole number, you'll pick the half size down. So let's say if you had 18 inches of mercury at idle, you'd be a 9. You would get an 8.5 for this. This is a 6.5, which means that this thing idles probably roughly at 13 or 14 inches of mercury. I don't know what this was on, so we'll switch that out and tune that accordingly. Also, that's just a general rule of thumb to start with. You could have engines that need more fuel, and you have to change this out to a lower one or a higher one. It's all in the tuning process, and that's something you got to kind of go through. Let's put that off to the side. It feeds the fuel through these ports right here, which go into these main wells that feed the jets. The main well is this tube that looks like it goes down into where our jet is. Now here's our emulsion tubes. It doesn't look like a tube, but it is a tube, an opening, whatever, and it's got a whole bunch of drilled holes in it, and these are all bleeds for air. So our jets go here, power valve goes here, idle mixture screws, power valve goes in the back, spins in here and opens to these ports, and that is our primary metering block. Now we'll just stick with the primaries just to finish off what we're doing here. And the last thing that we're going to do on the primary, or take off on the primary, is the squirter on the front. Now, a tip here is there's a gasket, there's a screw that holds it on, there's a gasket underneath that goes to the carb. The screw that holds it on has a gasket above it also. Don't pull this out without getting that gasket that's on the bottom, because it'll end up running through your engine and you don't want that. So here is our squirter. See the holes there? That's what I was talking about. That's where the fuel physically comes out. And those holes change in size. This is a 28. I'm not sure if you can read that, but there's a 28 printed right there. And that 28 is basically the 28 thousandths that these holes are opened up to. And it basically decides how much fuel gets shot into the engine through these little squirters. All right, now we're going to move on to the back. It's the same operation. Try not to rip our gasket so I can keep it as an extra. Same thing. We're not going to go through it again because you guys saw it. There's our float adjustment, the float itself, the diaphragm. We are going to take all this stuff apart and clean it, but we don't have to explain it again. Now, we are going to talk about our secondary metering block because it is different from the primary metering block in this circumstance, but it's not always like this. So if you guys look, while I take this gasket off and rip it into a million pieces, there's no power valve in this one. And some of them have a power valve, some of them don't in the secondaries, but this one does not. So you can get these mixed up, and also they're probably going to have different size jets in it, so try not to mix these up when you take them apart. Might even be a good idea if you have a hard time staying organized, which I do, maybe do one at a time while you're rebuilding this. Alright, so here's our secondary metering block. Again, no power valve, but it does have the jets in it. You can probably drill this and tap it for a power valve if you wanted to, but they're cheap enough just to buy. Has the same emulsion tubes and all the other orifices that are going to be the same for the most part. But don't mix these up, because if you put this in the front, this thing is not going to run right when you hit the throttle, and you don't want to hurt your engine. So, jets come out same way, flathead screwdriver. I'll take these out just so we could get a look at what size they are, which I could do without taking out. These are 80s. Alright, next I'm going to take off our base plate I can't stress this enough, guys. When you take these gaskets off, try your best not to rip them, because it's always good to have an extra one on the side just in case of an emergency or whatever. These might not be something you want to reuse if you had the choice, but if you don't, it's nice to have another one. Okay, I don't like how loose these are. Alright, we're just going to push our main body off. There is a gasket in here too, which you can replace. This one's in really good shape. I'll probably replace it anyway because we got it. So now we got two pieces. We got our base plate and the main body itself. Main body's gross, just like the rest of the carb. We're going to get it cleaned out, blow it out with some air, put it back together. New gaskets and everything else. This had a lot of spiders all over it, so there's entirely possible we could have some blockages somewhere, so we've got to blow everything out with air. But there it is. What a carburetor is designed to do, just like any other fuel system, is to atomize, vaporize, and homogenize the fuel in order to make it a fuel that can be burnt by the engine. So what is atomize? Atomize is break it down into like little droplets and stuff like that. That way it's not just like liquid raw fuel. Vaporize. Vaporize is take the liquid gasoline into a vapor form, a gas. And then homogenize. Homogenize is to mix with it and make an air-fuel mixture. You need air for fuel to ignite. The mixture itself is what actually our engines run on. That's the purpose of our carburetor, and it needs to be able to do all those things. So all these circuits need to be free and clear for fuel to flow through or air to flow through, and it's important that you get them blown out. What I'll say before we do that and put this thing back together is I forgot one part, and it's this. And you might be wondering, where did that come from? And it's because I completely forgot it. These go right underneath your squirters, and basically it's like a little check valve to make sure that your squirters don't just leak fuel into your engine all the time unless you're actually applying them. So they actually go into the hole, point down, and then when fuel is pressed up through that passage, it pushes this off its seat, pushes the fuel out the squirter. When the pump shot is done, it drops back down, closes off that port so you don't get like a significant leakage. You don't want to not have these. What I will say is when I turned it upside down to show you guys, I just happened to notice when I was looking at the table just now that this had fallen out. Don't forget these. So just so we're clear, goes right there, point down in that hole, which is where our squirter went. Yep, we need air now. And basically the idea here is pretty simple. It's blow everything out. Make sure it's clear. Doesn't matter really if you know what it's for. You know it's got to be free and clear. So take everything and blow air through it. Another thing you're going to need is some carb cleaner, brake cleaner, whatever. Just some, stuff to mostly clean this stuff off. You can see I'm shooting this all over the place. That's not actually important. Just make sure you get it on everything. The idea is to clean, So I'm going to blow out all these passages everywhere just to make sure. And as easy as that looks, our base plate is done. All you got to do is just make sure that nothing pops out like our check valve just did again because I turned it upside down again. I got to stop showing you guys stuff. It's messing me up. All right. Main body has holes on it also. Let's clear those out. So what you're looking for when you blow these things out is I'll show you. Now I'm just going to use my air to blow into a hole that's actually like just for a dowel. But see how there's no air coming out? Now it's not supposed to because like I said, that's just for a dowel. It's not an actual orifice. But basically when you're blowing this out, if you get a blocked passage, that's what it'll sound like versus this. Okay? This right here is where most of your rebuild work is going to get done because this is where all the parts are and there's a lot of orifices. This is really where you want to make sure you get cleaned. Also here, pretty much everywhere, but this has a lot of orifices that they're exposed to fuel all the time and these are what usually get blocked up. If you guys get curious and you want to follow some of these tracks and find out where stuff comes out, just blow air through it. And you'll see. It's like our jet comes out here. The other thing you could do if you get blocked passages is, I don't have the straw in here, but you could shove the straw inside of these passages on your brake cleaner, your carb cleaner, and you could spray it off. You could get it in there and make sure it gets inside the passage and clean it out. It's a good way to do it. Also, they sell small brushes that you could use to get in there. This, I believe, was running last time it was on a car, so we don't need to do that. All right, now you guessed it. Next thing up is the same thing. To clean this off and blow it out with air. Now the next principle of carburetors that's important to know is the Venturi effect. The outside of this diameter of the hole for the actual Venturi itself is smaller. If you look on the inside, you see how like they look, you know, the outside and the inside are different diameters. That's called the Venturi. And what it is it basically, the air comes in this way. I did just show you it from the backside, but the air comes in this way. And what it is basically is a traffic jam for the air. If you can think of it like this, the air comes in this way, and just like when you're in traffic for absolutely no reason, because everybody wants to look at the thing where the guy had a fender bender 17 hours ago and is blocked up traffic for everyone else, and you finally get to where that accident is, you ever notice how, well, everybody goes 500 miles an hour from there? Once you get up to that choke point, everybody can disperse and go 500 miles an hour, which is good because then you can get home. But that's the same effect. So basically what it does is, the reason I brought that up is because it actually slows the air down and then speeds the air back up when it increases the volume of the cylinder that it's inside of once it gets past that little bump or the accident. It also uses it as a signal to pull fuel. So once it gets past that Venturi, it actually speeds up the air, and the air itself creates a scavenging effect on a lot of the ports in here that actually pull fuel through them. So basically it creates a signal and it speeds the air up, which also in turn helps with getting the air, like I said, atomized, vaporized, homogenized, and into the engine. So, just so you know how these things work. All right, anyway, it's time to put this thing back together. I'm going to start putting this back together the same way that we started taking it apart, which is I'm actually going to put the base plate back on the main body. All right, now we got a cheap gasket set on Amazon, which is pretty much where everybody does all their shopping these days. And it comes with, like, pretty much everything. Needle and seat, power valve. We got little seals in there for everything, and all the gaskets for this stuff. Now, you may be looking at that and going, well, I didn't see 5,700 gaskets like this in this kit. Oh, that's nice. This is ripped. I didn't see all these gaskets come out of the carburetor, so why are they in here? How are we going to put all of them in? Well, you don't. These carburetors kits come with extra gaskets, just in case you have things that, you know, certain carburetors might have. These kits cover a lot of different stuff, like this would be for like a vacuum can or something, for a vacuum secondary. This is going to be one base plate gasket. There's two others in here that you could use. It basically depends on where the holes are laid out, what you're going to use. So these will fit a lot of different carburetors, so just make sure you find the right one. And don't just pick any one. We're going to start with the base plate, putting the base plate back on. So let me take out all the base plate gaskets. We'll compare them to what we have and make sure we pick the correct one. All right, now I got the one that makes sure that all of our passages are open. What I'll say is both of these gaskets would work, but you got to make sure you get the one that has the least amount of blockage on your little ports, or no blockage. Some of these, like this one, would have fit on here and it would have blocked this port just a little bit. I could cut the gasket, but they had this one, so I'm just going to use that one. Now I started with the two middle ones because I want to squish the gasket from the middle out. It's honestly just a habit. You probably don't have to do that. I'm also going to tighten these a little bit more than they were tightened from the beginning. All right, base plate is on. Only because we did it in this order and because I already have this put together, we are going to put back our secondary metering block. Before we do that though, we are going to change out the diaphragm and the check valve inside of this carburetor. Also, it's missing a check valve entirely. If you could see, you'd see it coming through one of these holes down here, and it's not. So, thought we were going to get away with not taking this off just for the sake of the video, but we're not. Alright, there's our diaphragm, comes off pretty good, it's in good shape. Spring, there's no check valve in here though, so we're going to put one. Here it is, basically this piece of rubber. What you're going to do here is take the piece of rubber, shove it through the middle hole, and then it's going to pop out on the back, and you're just going to pull it through the back. You're just going to pull until basically that little locking thing on there pulls all the way through. And then there you go, check valve in. Now we're going to put our spring back, grab a new diaphragm, we're going to put it back on. What I'll say here is when you're putting this back on, the arm has to hang off the side of the carburetor. You could put it on backwards and then it would face the inside of the carburetor and you're not going to be happy. So, another important thing when you're putting these carburetors together is nothing on a carburetor needs to be mongoloid tight. You do not need to gorilla anything on here. Nothing. None of these things in here need to be super duper crazy tight. I would say probably the mounting bolts for the carburetor to the manifold is what probably would be the tightest thing. And those don't need to be killer tight either. So don't go nuts. We blew out our secondary metering block, so we're going to throw a gasket on this. This is the same thing with these gaskets now. A metering block gets a gasket on one side and the other because it gets sandwiched between the main plate, the main body, and the fuel bowl. So make sure you got both of those gaskets and that they're correct. Look at that, ripped right out of the box. This is why you got to make sure you save the other ones and they're not in bad shape, because this is torn right out of the bag here. All right, again, we're doing our secondary metering block, which is the one without the power valve. Got the gasket picked out. I'm going to place it on to our main body. The jets go outwards. Here is our secondary fuel bowl. And again, forgot something. We got to replace our needle and seat and the gaskets. Almost forgot. What I like to do with these is I turn them in until basically the needle and seat is starting to move the float itself. And then I kind of just like where the shoulder part of the nut is, that's where I'll put it. I'll just stop threading it in there. Put a gasket basically underneath. Then there's our little jam nut. There's already a gasket on there. I'm not going to tear it off because I run out of these all the time, but we have an extra in the kit, so you would change that also. That's tightened down. This is ready to go on now. I'm going to reuse these gaskets only because both of the gaskets I got in the kit that I just bought are ripped on the bottom, which is why you save these. Now we're ready to put the fuel bowl back on. This is something you want to make sure you do, because if you put it on like this, it'll go on, you'll be upset. Make sure that this is flipped to the correct position, and make sure that this arm goes underneath, like that. If you don't do that, you will be taking this off again. Also, something to keep note of, that these bolts, should have mentioned it before, have a gasket on them. The kit comes with them. I don't like the type of gaskets that are in the kit, so I'm going to reuse these because they still work. But they do have a gasket on them for you to change. So just make sure you have a gasket on each one. While this is going back together, it just did remind me that if you guys did want to change these floats, as we talked about earlier, it's real easy. You just take it out, pull this pin out, float is separate from the bracket, and you can change the float out if need be. When you're ready, shove the pin back through, and then you bolt the whole assembly back in. Very easy. Again, you only need to do that if you actually have to replace the float for some reason. Alright, same process with our primary bowl. I put our needle and seat in. Got to put a new check valve into our accelerator pump area. Here it is, it's in. The gaskets on this, make sure you get them right, are not the same size. One gasket's got to go over the whole needle and seat. Then you've got the little adjuster nut. The top gasket only has to go around the bolt itself. So make sure you get these right because they're not the same size. Now we do have a new power valve, and it has a number on the side of it, but it's punched in so badly that I don't know what size it is. So, you guessed it, back to the old one. I am going to replace the gasket though. So put that old gasket inside, replace it with our new gasket, and then we'll put it in from the back side like that. You do want to make sure that this gasket goes in correctly because they can walk a little bit. So just be careful. Put our jets back in. Again, if we were tuning, we may be changing these jets. But we're just doing a rebuild right now, so we're just going to throw back what we had. Throw our gasket on. Place it on the main body. Doing it in a little bit of a different order, but we're going to put the fuel bowl on now. Now, this is what I meant about doing it in a little bit of a different order here. We didn't put our diaphragm back on, so we'll place our spring in there. Put our diaphragm on. Oh, this is what I was talking about. This is exactly what I was talking about as far as an upgrade. I almost put this on, and without realizing it, this is a 50 cc diaphragm, which would be more of an accelerator pump shot. So this is actually an upgrade. We're not using that because that's not what we have. In order to use this, you also have to change this to a 50 cc pump shot cup, or whatever they call this thing, housing. We don't have that, so we're not using it. Remember what I said about this. Make sure that arm is in the correct position. So that brings up a good point, guys. When you're rebuilding anything, carburetor or anything else, make sure you look at all the parts before you just start shoving stuff in. Reason being, if I had just put this in, this would have all been crunched up. It wouldn't have operated right. It would have got bunched up like that. So just make sure you use the right stuff. I'm going to put our check valve in for the 15th time. I'll get new gaskets for our squirters and I'll shove those on. Alright, I got new gaskets on there. This is a delicate process because you do not want to drop that gasket in the engine. Alright, there you go. She's rebuilt. And by rebuilt, I mean I took it apart, cleaned it, blew out the passages, and shoved new gaskets on it. You know, I didn't like melt it down, you know, to like a foundry or something and then rebuild it. But you know what I mean. So that's what we're here for. But we're not finished. Before we put this on, I'm going to show you guys basically how I would set this up to get it prepared to just shove on. Because if you just shove it on right now, everything is in a different setting and things may have been changed. So basically I'm going to show you right now how I would set this up to set this on my engine. Alright, first things first, only because it's one of the more annoying things to do, is right here. I mentioned this and mentioned how it's important. And right here, the distance between the bottom of that screw and your lever arm is really important. Because if it's pushed too far down, I mean, I'll exaggerate it, but if it's pushed too far down, it's going to, one, have this sort of activated all the time, and two, when you do go to push it, you only have that much left to push it, which means you're not using this full shot. So you want it to be, I think Holly wants it at 15 thousandths between the arm and the screw. Now that's going to be done quite honestly with a feeler gauge, just like this. Doesn't matter what kind you got, but what you're going to do is you're going to shove that feeler gauge in between the arm itself and the mounting screw, and you want exactly pretty much what I have, which is the arm just literally starts to move when I put that feeler gauge in there. If I pull the screw back and let it go, it doesn't actually actuate the arm. So this is literally set perfect, but that's probably because I think I set this one already. Make sure you do both of them. This one's a little bit tight, actually. This one's just a little bit tight. So I'm going to adjust that. All right, so the way that you adjust this lever arm is with 2 3/8 wrenches. And what you're going to do is you're basically going to thread the... Ours is activated too much. Now, I don't know if you can see this. I'll show you. When I pull the... You see how the arm comes up a little bit? So I don't want that. What I'm going to do is thread the bolt into this nut a little bit, which will actually suck the bolt up a little bit. So let's do that. All right, so it's not activating the arm anymore when it's not supposed to be. When I shove the feeler gauge in there, it does start to activate. What I think I might do is put a half a turn back into it, just so it's nice and tight on the feeler gauge, and then we'll be done. The next thing that I kind of already did was where I set the float heights. I set them with the bowl upside down off the carburetor and turned the seat in until it basically started to just activate start pushing up the float, and that basically just to make contact with it. That usually, in my experience, has put me sort of where I'm supposed to be. Your float height on carburetors with the screw, the sight screw like this that comes out, is you want the fuel to be, when you rock the car like this, you want the fuel to just be coming out of that hole just a little bit, like sloshing over. That's the correct float height. So you got to mess with the needle and seat in order to get that correct. On carburetors that have a sight glass, which is basically just a window that doesn't come out, you want to be in the middle of this hole. So if that's the sight glass, you want it to be in the middle. The next thing is our idle mixture screws. Before I put the carburetor on there, I'm going to set these a turn and a half out. So what you're going to do is you're going to turn them all the way in until you reach a stop. Don't crank them, because remember, it's just a tiny little screw with a point on the end of it. You could break it or hurt it. So just until you get to a dead stop, and then what you're going to do is a turn, 3 turns, 3 half turns. So that's half a turn, 1 full turn, 1.5 turns. This carburetor only has 2 corner idle adjustment, which is just on the primary metering block. Some have all 4 corners for each Venturi. So I'm going to do the same thing to the other side just to get this in the ballpark. Idle speed screw is going to be next. This is more of a play with it type item. What I'll say is a good way to set this would be get it to the point where it just starts to move this lever arm. I don't know if you guys can see that. Just get to move this lever arm, which is like right there, and then I'll give it 1 turn. You probably will have to mess with that, either give it more or less to get your car to idle right, because every car is different. But basically at that point you want to make sure that you have all of your vacuum ports on, or make sure that you plug what you're not using. Like on this carburetor, whatever this was on, I wasn't using this. And then the only other thing that you might change for now would be these accelerator pump cams, but that's really more of a running kind of tuning object, so you're not doing that now. Now basically this thing's ready to go. Hopefully that kind of took some of the mystery out of these things and rebuilding them. It's really easy, guys. I know you guys can handle it. Hopefully that helped somebody. If it did, subscribe to the channel. Give the video a like. Share it with somebody, you know. As always, thank you guys for watching, and American Nostalgia Garage out.